Hi, I'm Paul Holes, and I'm a retired cold case investigator out of the Contra Costa County DA's office. Today, I'm going to give you an introduction to one of the most unique and bizarre cases I've ever been involved with. I've been involved in cases for almost 30 years now, and I've worked cases of all sorts. However, one case stands out as being so unique that I thought it's important to bring it to the public's attention. And that case is Bodfish. Some cases have a tendency to just kind of blend into others. I knew as soon as I walked into this crime scene that it was going to be very different. I was initially sent to this as a crime scene investigator. I was a deputy sheriff criminalist at the time. And I was told a man had been found dead inside his residence, an apparent bludgeoning victim. That's usually an unusual set of circumstances. But as you will see, as soon as I walked into this crime scene, I was transported into a medieval world. As I'm approaching the garage door to lead into the house, I hear this buzzing sound. And the buzzing sound is getting louder and louder as I get closer. And as soon as I open the door to go inside, the buzzing sound just comes around me. And that buzzing sound, which I initially thought was potentially electrical, turned out to be flies that are flying everywhere inside this house. Turns out the victim had been bludgeoned 5 days before. Over the course of those 5 days, it was June 1999, temperatures had exceeded 100 degrees. So this crime scene, with a human body being dead for 5 days in a 100-degree temperature, was bad. As I walk into the residence, I'm walking into a great room, and this great room had this medieval decor. Can see through from the kitchen into the room where I've got the victim, Emmon Bodfish, lying on his back. There's a baseball bat down by his feet. A painting has been pulled off the wall, dismantled, and laid on the floor. Kind of taking a look at the surrounding residence. Very dark, with a huge Persian rug that eventually we were told was worth over $100,000. And in fact, when I walked into this residence, parked in the garage was a Bentley. Wood paneling throughout this room, the very heavy velvet drapes were all drawn, so the room was very dark as I come into it. I could see chalices lining the mantel over the fireplace. So this is standing out as what kind of lifestyle does this victim lead? The only light coming into the room was from an open window as well as the gap in the curtain. So I get a sense of the inside of the residence. And now I go back out to the victim's Bentley and end up doing my inventory process of what is present in there, trying to get a sense of what the victim was doing before he goes into the house and was killed. In the front seat of the car is a grocery bag and just perishable groceries, some supplements that the victim had purchased, and this book the victim was currently reading, called The Fabric of Reality. Folded inside this book was this handwritten letter. And I ended up reading this. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the whole thing. However, this is where this letter gave me pause in terms of, okay, what are we dealing with in this homicide case? The victim himself wrote, "Tell Body it's a stupid piece of shit that should be beaten to death." And then a little later on, "How do I feel about my aliveness at this moment?" the book asks. "I hate it, I just want out." So now, having come out of this medieval homicide scene, and I'm reading this letter, it almost sounds like the victim is desiring to take his own life. And I just saw where the victim had been beaten to death inside his house. Exactly what he's writing in this letter. So who is Emmon Bodfish? Well, Emmon Bodfish was born Margaret Bodfish, daughter of wealthy Chicago banking family, grew up sort of in an elite status. In fact, had been raised by a verbally abusive nanny. Eventually, Margaret gets involved in alternate religions and settles into the Druid religion and becomes a third order priestess in the Druid religion. 1977, Margaret has a hysterectomy, and things go very wrong in terms of how Margaret psychologically dealt with that. 17 years of the victim's diaries were found at one of the residents. I ended up reading all 17 years worth of those diaries. So I have got a really good sense of what the victim was thinking over the course of several decades. Early on, after this hysterectomy, Margaret decided she needed to complete the spaying process. In the early 1980s, had her breasts removed, and then eventually ended up becoming a man and changed the name to Emmon. Emmon was a voracious reader. Books lined bookshelves throughout this house. Victimology is huge when looking at a case like this. And so one of my practices was to make sure I paid attention to the types of books that the victim was reading. And there was a lot of interesting books, but one stood out. It was called Poof: How to Disappear and Create a New Identity. And as I thumbed through this book, I'm seeing Emmon making notes about how to do just this. Basically, Emmon wanted to drop out of society. These notes included setting up a bank account in a friend's name, and then how to transfer funds between two different Swiss bank accounts to a Japanese account. So Emmon would be able to, in essence, launder money so it'd be untraceable back to him. And then as I'm thumbing through the book, I run across this cryptic writing, which is like, well, what is that? Now, correlating what's going on in Emmon's life, the diaries are hugely significant. And seeing how he is thinking, be ready to disappear, money stashed. Irene's book, that's the book the Poof, How to Disappear and Create a New Identity. So Emmon is in the process of getting his life to where he is going to slip out of society and literally wanted to live in the middle of nowhere. But as I'm reading the diaries, Emmon turns out to be haunted by an internal demon. He names this demon the Blue Demon Conscience, and how this demon would nag at him in times of panic or when he thought he wasn't living up to others' expectations. This demon became all-encompassing to Emmon, and he wrote about this demon so much that instead of having to write Blue Demon Conscience over and over again, he eventually shortens it to the acronym BLDC. And then as his writings in the diaries progress, BLDC becomes more and more of an impediment to Emmon living a happy life. Eventually, Emmon realizes that BLDC is occupying different areas within his head. And he found that if he hit himself in the head where he thought BLDC was at, it would quiet the demon for a period of time. So the diary is filled with sketches where at that moment where Emmon thought BLDC resided. Eventually, Emmon's desire to escape society and live alone where nobody could find him turned into a desire to leave this world. In essence, to move on to the next life. Emmon believed in reincarnation. However, his biggest concern is how am I going to get to the next life without the Blue Demon Conscience following me? But his diary progresses where it's now writing new perspective. I leave the body instead of getting BLDC to leave or be quiet or learn. Emmon ends up figuring out over years that his only hope of happiness in the next life would be to somehow get BLDC to stay behind in his old body. Eventually, Emmon's writing may have found a way to lick the law, because there was lots of hurdles in terms of trying to move on to the next life that could potentially prevent him from accomplishing his goals. Throughout the diaries, Emmon is very introspective, and I'm reading, and he says he asked Danu, one of the gods, "Please don't let them take our home away from me." And then the god answered, "There is one way to avoid that." And then there's that cryptic writing again. What is being written there? "There you have it," Emmon wrote. "Act that out, it's true. Nothing more to do. Our life project now is," and more cryptic writing. This becomes critical. What is Emmon writing here? Is this a clue to what happened to Emmon, to the homicide case? So of course, I'm trying to figure out this cryptic writing. In part, I'm going around, I'm doing research, I'm buying books on runes, magical alphabets, trying to see, is this an existing language? And turns out this was a language that Emmon himself completely created. And I did my little junior sleuthing, cipher, I was thinking it was just a simple substitution cipher, so I'm drawing out all the symbols that I'm seeing in the diaries and how frequently that they are occurring to see if I could actually translate this language so I could see what these clues might be. And I was never able to decipher Emmon's writing. However, one of the homicide investigators who had attended the FBI Academy about a year after the case ended up creating a connection with the FBI, and we were able to get some of the writing to the FBI's team, who were able to break Emmon's code. And so now we can see, as an example, that one passage that I wrote, nothing more to do. Our life project now is cryptic writing. They're able to see that what Emmon wrote is beating BLDC to a pulp for what she did until she don't want to do that no more. So this writing, even the English writing, but even the cryptic writing, is entirely consistent with Emmon's wishes to be beaten to death. Getting deeper into the victimology, one of the authors that Emmon was reading is Starhawk. And so now I'm finding Starhawk's book, the Pagan Book of Living and Dying, to learn about those things that Emmon is reading and researching to see if they would have significance, any philosophies out of Starhawk's book that would have significance to the homicide. And here, Starhawk writes how many pagans support assisted suicide for the terminally ill. The lead investigators had found out that Emmon was starting to tell people about a year before his death that had terminal cancer. So is this Emmon trying to set up a sympathetic group who would potentially come and kill him in a way that he needed to be killed, needed to be bludgeoned to death in order to escape the demon? Now, in taking a look at what happened during the homicide, Emmon was bludgeoned to death right next to this room divider. And so I'm now moving into the mode of paying attention to the blood patterns to help reconstruct what's going on. And I ended up gridding off the room divider as well as the bookshelf. You can see the amount of blood spatter that is happening. This is a result of repeated blows from the murder weapon into a pooled blood source, which would have been Emmon's face and head. There was blood patterns that indicated that Emmon was actually upright, probably in a seated position, at a time when he received a blow to his head that produced blood spatter. Now, this is important because It requires a bleeding source or a pooled blood source in order to produce this type of blood pattern. So this means that prior to being in this seated position, there is at least one more blow that caused the blood to flow, and then a subsequent blow that caused this blood pattern to occur. So this is indicating that the offender is hitting Emmon as Emmon is in the process of going down. And then ultimately, Emmon is laying on his back and numerous blows being inflicted to his face and head, causing a tremendous amount of blood spatter. There was so much blood spatter, in fact, that the weapon had to be coated with blood because there was cast-off marks of blood being flung off the weapon up onto the ceiling and behind where the offender was standing. So I know the murder weapon was bloody. There was a baseball bat left at the scene. The baseball bat is basically devoid of any blood. This is not the murder weapon. In fact, the murder weapon was taken away from the crime scene. However, this becomes a huge clue. This baseball bat had a black paint transfer on it that matched the black from the frame of that room divider. That room divider had broken glass in it right above Emmon's right leg, and on the end of the baseball bat, embedded in it, was powdered glass. Right below this broken glass on the room divider, Emmon had a very significant bruise to his right knee. This baseball bat hadn't been used to kill Emmon, hadn't been used to inflict the bleeding injuries, but had been used to inflict at least one blow to Emmon's lower body. So I'm looking at this going, well, it doesn't make any sense for an offender who is beating Emmon as he's going down to the ground and then finishing him off while he's laying on his back to then now use a different object to start inflicting blows to Emmon's lower body. It occurs to me, and my theory is that I've got two offenders. I've got one offender that's inflicting blows to Emmon's head area and is standing off to the left of Emmon's shoulder. And then another offender that is using this bat to inflict blows to Emmon's lower body. Two offenders. Now, I mentioned how dark this crime scene was. Well, one of the sources of light was this open window. In fact, this window was broken, and it had a broken pane in it. In this photograph, Emmon's body is over to the left, and here's the broken pane, and all the glass happened to be on the outside, on the ledge or down on the ground on the outside. None of the broken pieces were on the inside of the house. In addition, there was an open door that was right around the corner from that broken window. So now it's like, well, what was the state? Was this window open and was this door open when law enforcement first arrived? And so I go in to the case file and determine they were. Well, this becomes hugely significant because remember, I mentioned that there were these fly maggots in Emmon's face, two different sizes. One was very large, one was tiny, and two different colors. I ended up collecting all this entomology evidence and sent this to an entomologist, and he was able to identify the fly species. One being a very common fly that would have been inside the house, and as soon as Emmon was killed, would have come and laid its eggs on Emmon. This fly had larvae that was 5 days old. However, there is another fly that's not typically an indoor species. However, if it had ready access to Emmon's body, should have deposited its eggs relatively close to the time of death. However, this other fly ended up, its larvae was only 2 days old. So the entomologist is saying, well, that doesn't make any sense with the broken window, the open window, and the open door. This outdoor species should have come in and its larvae should have been the same age as this other species of fly. So it became apparent that what ended up happening is when Emmon was killed, the house was closed for 3 days. The door was closed. The window had to have been closed. And then 3 days later, There was a secondary intrusion. Somebody comes into the crime scene and ends up leaving the window open, leaving the door open, thus allowing this other fly species to come in and lay its eggs. Just to the side of where Emmon was laying, on basically the north wall of that room, a picture had been taken off the wall. That picture, the frame was completely disassembled, and the offender had tried to peel the canvas with the painting away from its backing, but it had been glued, and the offender abandoned that effort. Now this frame is resting on top of the bat. That gives me sequencing information. The bat was put there first, and then the frame was put on top. In the adjacent room was another painting that basically was an identical painting, just a slightly different subject in it, had been taken off the wall, and once again, the frame completely disassembled, the paper backing torn into many pieces, and that painting is missing. It has been stolen. I'm now taking a look at this painting that's missing, and that paper backing to it turns out, previously, probably by Emmon, had been cut away and then taped back into place. Started wondering, considering what Emmon was doing when he was trying to set up a mechanism to disappear, is it possible that Emmon himself had hidden important information behind that painting, and that the offenders knew that, and that's why they focused on taking this painting with them? The painting itself had no value. The offenders were prepared. On the glass for the painting that was missing, through latent processing, uncovered a glove print, and it was a leather glove. I could see a seam, I could see an area of fabric, as well as leather fingertips and a wristband. And I was able to track down a Nike batting glove that, in essence, I had identical features. I can't say it's the exact make and model of glove that was used, but it was close enough to where I think it very possibly could have been. So I've got this youth softball bat that was left behind. I've got an offender wearing a batting glove to prevent leaving fingerprints. In addition, we had processed the entire house for shoe prints left in dust on the floor. Ended up getting the same shoe print in multiple areas of the residence that was very clear and very distinct in terms of the tread pattern. This is my drawing of this tread pattern that I sent to the FBI for them to search their shoe database to try to determine the make and model of shoe. And eventually, the FBI didn't have this pattern in their database, but I found this shoe at Payless Shoes. And that was literally going through shoe store after shoe store, flipping shoes until I found this shoe. Turns out that this shoe was, the shoe prints from the Payless shoe was in the area where both paintings had been hanging on the wall. It was also in the areas where the window had been opened and the door had been left open. So now, even though I was excited that I had this shoe, because of the windows occur, the window and the door being open occur during the secondary intrusion, start to wonder, is this the shoe that the secondary intruder wore? Is this the killer? Did this killer kill Emmon, 3 days later come back, possibly perform a ritual, deal with the paintings, and then leave the window and the door open? And in part of my research within the pagan religion, that this is something that might happen in terms of if there is a violent death or an unexpected death within a residence, nothing is touched for 3 days. Otherwise, the soul might get confused. But then after 3 days, you open a window or a door, and that allows the soul to move on. Is that what's going on here? And is this Payless shoe wearer my secondary intruder who is aware of Emmon's religious needs? It was either a week or 2 weeks after finishing processing this scene, I get called back out. Emmon's attorney was trying to settle the estate. There was a lot of money. You know, you've got the Bentley, you've got the $100,000 Persian rug, and other items of value in the house. Something that I had dismissed, and I was a relatively young kid at the time and I didn't know any better, in this closet, turns out there was a floor safe. When I initially saw it, I thought it was plumbing for a toilet. They had converted a bathroom into a closet and never looked at it any further. Turns out it's a floor safe. And what was contained in the floor safe? A lot of gold. And of course, that's why the attorney wants to know it. There is no evidence that the offenders tried to access this safe. So it's not like they, came in to do a robbery and then abandoned trying to get to this gold. I don't think they even were aware that the gold existed, or possibly didn't even care about it. So now, prime suspect, Emmon, had a son, Max. The day after Emmon's body was found, Max commits suicide down in Santa Monica, down in the Los Angeles area. He filled up a hotel bathtub, ended up writing a suicide note, and then just carved his arm and neck up and laid down in the tub of water. Here we see Max at the homicide location sometime prior to the homicide occurring. This is the painting that the offender had taken off the wall that was resting on top of the baseball bat. Per the investigation, this painting was something that Emmon would refer to and say, "This painting reminds me of me." Whereas the painting that was missing out of the other room, which turns out to be Max's room, that painting reminded Emmon of Max. And so here's a photo of Max looking like he's cowering in front of this painting that Emmon thought looked like him. During the investigation, going into Max's residence, he has a list of people who should be dead. And who's number one on the list? Mother. But he's also got almost 20 other people listed. And most of these were his closest friends. And one of the things that I did, in addition to reading Emmon's diaries, is I read 10 years of Max's diaries. And he looked at death very differently than the normal person. Death was a good thing because this life was so miserable. So I look at this and I don't see it as this is him basically desiring that mom is dead because it's out of anger. I can see this where he knows his mom's suffering and she needs to be relieved of that suffering. So where was Max? Emmon was killed June 25th. Max, 3 days before, starts heading down to Southern California. And we have receipts that track his movements as he's going down to Southern California, and then receipts showing him in the Santa Barbara area leading up to the date that Emmon's killed. But we don't have a receipt on June 25th to show where he was at. And then the day after Emmon's killed, June 26th, we have a receipt back down in Santa Barbara. And then on the 27th, he's now in Huntington. So one of the theories is that Max drove down to Southern California, then drove all the way back up to the Bay Area, killed his mother, and then drove back down to Santa Barbara. We also don't have a receipt for Max on the date of the secondary intrusion. So is Max the one that came back up from Southern California in order to deal with his mother's religious needs and then goes back down to Southern California, and once he hears that his mom's body has been found, he commits suicide? That's a theory. However, when I went down to take a look at Max's body as well as to process the evidence that was recovered with his body out of the room and his car, I couldn't find anything related to the homicide up in Orinda, California. The murder weapon wasn't there. None of the shoes, the gloves were present. The missing painting wasn't present. So I couldn't tie Max to the homicide all the way up in Northern California. To me, this is another big clue. This is Max's room where the painting was taken off the wall and the painting's missing. If you pay attention to the drawers, all the drawers are pulled out. Now, to the average person, that may not mean much. When I look at that, I'm seeing a very experienced criminal. This is an accomplished burglar. Somebody who's not very good at committing a burglary, very new at it, will typically open a drawer, look in it, and now to see what's in the drawer underneath it, will close that top drawer and open up the next drawer. A very experienced burglar, time is of the essence, will start at the bottom drawer and just open it up, and then go to the next drawer and open that up, and can very quickly go through a set of drawers, just like we see here. We have the same thing happening to the desk. This was Max's former room. Why would Max do this? In fact, if he were going into the drawers, I don't see him doing it in this manner. This tells me I am dealing with somebody who has committed burglaries before, has a criminality to them. Is this person the killer? Is this person the secondary intruder? Don't know.